So, Dr. Lori Walkington, I am a faculty member of the Department of Sociology and teach mainly in the courses for our criminology and justice studies degree. Also happen to be an alumni with an undergraduate and master's degree from CSUSM. So, hey, everybody.
Hey. All right. And you're going to moderate tonight. I'm going to just set some ground rules real quick. I'm going to be keeping my eye on the chat, the question and answer. Dr. Walkington will moderate, and I'm gonna be your backup. So behave yourselves, all right? And today we have 3 panelists for you discussing the film, The 13th. Very powerful film, very important film, especially for the times we're going through right now. And we have with us Dr. Abumaye, Dr. Mohamed Abumaye from Sociology, Javier Garden, he's a Project Rebound hero, and super excited to always work with him. And then we have Michael Garrett. We also had on the panel Dr. Ubi Ali, but unfortunately she won't be able to join us tonight. We'll send some good wishes and good vibes to her. She wasn't feeling well, so we're gonna keep her in our thoughts for sure. But if we can start this evening by asking our panelists to share 3 to 5 minutes, a little about themselves, and then also something from the film, and hopefully everybody got to see the film. That way when they're sharing, it doesn't seem foreign to you. But y'all had homework. I hope you did your homework. So 3 to 5 minutes about who you are, what you do on campus, and something from the film that really stood out to you as important, especially something in the message we're going to drive home. Okay, so we'll start off with Mr. Garrett, then we'll go to Dr. Abumaye, and then we'll go to Mr. Garden. Is that cool? All right, Mr. Garrett, you're up.
So hello, everyone. First and foremost, I want to thank the moderators and the panelists for being a part of this event. My name is Michael Garrett, and a little bit about myself. I am a 4th year double majoring in sociology and criminology, and I am your current ASI president. I want to thank you all for coming to our discussion on this historic day in the Black community, Juneteenth. Hopefully we've all seen the documentary by now, The 13th, but one part that really stuck out to me was about a 14-year-old kid named Emmett Till, who was not only wrongfully killed, but brutalized and tortured. I first heard about Emmett when I was 5 years old. My mother made me and my sister watch a documentary and learn about his story. And I saw then how he was treated just because of the color of his skin. She didn't show us that so that we could see what America was like, but why America is how it is today. When I see or hear about police brutality or mass incarceration, I can relate it back to 65 years ago, to when a 14-year-old boy was beaten ruthlessly just because of the color of his skin. Today, as we celebrate Juneteenth, remember the names of those who lost their lives due to an illegitimate marker that America has constructed to label one's worth. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Garrett. Dr. Abumaye.
Yes, thank you for that, Garrett. Actually, Garrett was a student of mine in the Black Communities class, and we were actually discussing the brutal murder of Emmett Till. So I'm so proud of you, see you out here. So I always got to shout out my students. A little bit about myself. I'm a social professor. My work is on policing, anti-Blackness, looking at the Black community as well. And in terms of kind of the more political work that I do a lot of community organizing around policing in San Diego and the Somali refugee community, and many of the ways in which Black immigrants have been marginalized. And my more broader work is and I think as this moment has really shown, I am single-mindedly in many ways committed to Black liberation and the dismantling of white supremacy. And hopefully this documentary shows why it's important to not just tackle police, and specifically with police do not exist outside of the context of white supremacy.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Abumaye. Appreciate that. Mr. Garden, you're up.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks. So I'm Javier Garden. I'm a Project Rebound student, also a member of the Transitions Collective. The most important part of the film to me was when they were going over not only the Reagan administration, but the Clinton administration, and how different policies were rolled out to further suppress the Black community, almost in a way where if you are poor, Black, you're almost guaranteed to somehow, some way, like fall into, you know, the different traps that the system has like set for you. And I just reflect on like my own experiences as a youth. And back then I didn't really understand, you know, like how the system worked, but watching 13th and, you know, looking back and reflecting back on my own experiences, that one just like hit home a little bit more when they were discussing things like the drug laws, mandatory minimums, different like clauses that they put into policies to directly like target the Black community. And yeah, that was overall the most important thing I took from the film.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Garden. Now, last but not least, and our wonderful moderator, if you could please introduce yourself and your work and take us into this great discussion, Dr. Lori Walkington.
Thank you, thank you. Welcome everybody. Javier, it's really good to see you, and lay eyes on you. Javier is one of the students who I know from campus, and I'm always after him about self-care, which is important for Black folk to do because we cannot live without our lives. So good to see you, Javier. My name again is Dr. Lori Walkington, and my areas of specialization tend to center around transformative social justice, which looks at the causes of what's happening in these communities, the law enforcement violence, mass incarceration, the poverty that is associated with that, the family disruption that is endemic within all of this, that the structure and the institutions are the cause. Those are the effect, right? And so the way in which we address these things is not by individual measures, but instead looking at the institutions. And so this film is really a good culmination of that part of what I do, mixed in with a critical race theory framework and basis, with a Black feminist framework and basis that also centers media and culture and the ways in which these things interact to shape how we understand each other, our own communities, communities that we don't have any access to. And so one of the things that stood out to me, and a couple questions that I'm going to focus on this evening, is the thin red line that went through the entire film, that was the conversation between media, how the institutions and structures and their arms of power used media in order to create monsters, super predators, creatures that are less than human, right? And on the other side, how those in resistance to those stereotype constructions and the consequences, the very tangible lived consequences of those resist, right? So the media was central in this film, and that's one of the things that stood out. On the other hand, the glaring absence of Black women and how Black women have been victim and decimated by mass incarceration alongside our men. And also alongside that arm of power, the two go hand in hand, mass incarceration and police violence. Breonna Taylor is not the first. Breonna Taylor will not be the last. Breonna Taylor was added, like all of the rest, as a afterthought. And so my focus here tonight is primarily going to be to remember to center Black women who are also caught up in mass incarceration and victim of police violence. So, yay, happy sociologist. I wanted to start with a question that kind of goes along those lines, if you all wouldn't mind. And thank you, Michael, for giving a shout out to Juneteenth. One of the questions that was pre-submitted by students was, what is Juneteenth? What is the importance of it? The importance of it is that we finally found out that we were supposed to be free. We still waiting. This is part of that fight to get free, to get there, right? So thank you for that question. It's a good place to start. One of the things, my computer's screaming at me, sorry, okay. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about related to the media to get us started and get your thoughts on these things is that what are your ideas about the necessity of using media as a form of resistance, and how do we engage that resistance without adding to the growing collection of what I'm calling, or we're calling, the pornography of Black pain, right? This idea that it traumatizes us to continue to see people who look like us, people who live near us, sound like us, go to work like us, get dead and get killed and murdered on the television. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on the sort of constant thread that went through the film about the need to use media. Michael mentioned Emmett Till. Breonna Taylor was killed in her home while she was sleeping, much like Fred Hampton. And so I wonder, you know, and that image, many of us are very familiar with. So if you all could speak a little bit to the necessity, or if it's necessary, to continue to use media in this way.
Yeah, so I can start with this question.
Thank you.
I think first and foremost, I do think that it's very important to remember the names of the people who were wrongfully killed for murders by police brutality. But just equally important, I think that people should also know the names of African Americans or people of color who have also succeeded and who have changed the world. So for example, it's important for people to know the name Frederick Douglass, who was the first African American to be nominated for the vice presidency of the United States. And it's important for people to know the name of W.E.B. Du Bois, who's the first African American to get their doctorate in the United States, and is the co-founder of the NAACP. So I think that that just only looking at African Americans in a way of being brutalized by the police can be toxic if you're not also adding how African Americans have survived and how African Americans have overcome adversity.
Yeah, I'd like to jump on that as well. I think Dr. Walkington makes a really important point, which is really looking at the pornography of Black pain, right? Of Black death, of Black bodies being mutilated. That doesn't just begin with, you know, a present moment of police violence, right? But these images of Black death have been circulating, you know, all the way back to the 1920s, right? The 19th century, 18th century. And what it really does is, one, it makes people think that Black people are immune to pain. It desensitizes people to Black pain, and it makes Black death normal and normalizes it, right? And it limits the entirety of the Black experience to just suffering, right? And I think for me, these images, right, you know, they so often focus on the victim, right? But it doesn't, by itself, the dying Black bodies don't expose the systems that created the conditions for that death in the first place, right? We need much more of a focus, you know, not just on, you know, how this person died, right? But how does institutional racism function? How does white supremacy function? You know, just even if you look at the film, from the slew of films about slavery, right, that we've seen the past couple of years, right? The kind of media representations and Blackness and who consumes it. But I think one way Dr. Walkington brings up of how can we use media is, I really love this field of what's called Afrofuturism, right? And Afrofuturism is, how do Black people imagine a future, right? Because death is final. There is no beyond death, right? But Afrofuturism looks at film, media, literature, in which Black people use fiction to imagine an alternative world, right? Because so often the question for Black liberation and Blackness is, how do we get free? But also, what is beyond freedom? What is after that, right? And so I think in really important ways, I think we need to support and really invest in Black artists, right? The creative arts, Black musicians, poetry, right? So on and so forth, literature, filmmaking, like Ava DuVernay. And I think that we need to imagine beyond just centering Black pain, right? And in many ways, right, I like what Dr. Walkington says, pornography, because who consumes it, right? Who watches all these films about Black death and suffering? It's a predominantly white audience, right? And in many ways, does it humanize Blackness? It does not humanize Black people, right? In normal, it always equates Blackness with death and suffering, right? When Blackness and what it means to be Black is so much more complex, so much more nuanced than that, right? And I think young Black people are really at the forefront of, you know, using social media, creating fiction, and imagining alternatives, right? Like thinking about the importance of Black pleasure, right? And centering Black pleasure. What does that look like?
Jennifer Nash, Janice Smith, so much up in there. Sorry, Javi, I stepped on you. Go ahead.
Oh, it's all good. So speaking to what Michael and Professor Abumaye were saying, I would like to see a little bit more focus on positive Black media, although the media that we're seeing, like the police killings and stuff like that, police brutality, I do believe it is necessary to have that visible, because I feel like one thing that I've noticed, especially lately, is like it makes it undeniable. There are still people out there who deny, you know, like what they're seeing with their very eyes, like an unarmed Black male, you know, being shot in the back, unarmed Black male being, you know, choked to death in the street. But I believe for the most part, when you think about it as, like, I guess a societal thing, when you think about it from that scope, it just makes it undeniable to your neighbor that, you know, like, this is going on, this is happening. This isn't something that we're making up. Because one thing 13th touched on that I really didn't know, because it was before like my lifetime, was that before, you know, there was like widespread denial because people weren't seeing it. You would hear about, oh, this happened like in Mississippi, this happened in Alabama, this happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but you weren't seeing it with your own eyes. There was no way for you to see that in action, you seeing it happen. And I believe that that's one thing, you know, the smartphone changed when it comes to, you know, our fight against state violence. But with that being said, while that is necessary media to have, I would like to see more of a focus on Black arts, especially, you know, Black film. Professor Abumaye mentioned, you know, Afrofuturism. I do think it is necessary and very important for us to envision a future where we are, you know, a free people. Because one, it gives us something, it gives us, you know, that ability to, in a way, like create that future for ourselves. Like we can, you know, like sit as a community, think about, okay, like where do we go from here? And once we get to where we're going, what does that look like? What do we want that to look like? Most importantly, is what I think is the most important takeaway from Afrofuturism. And also, I think I would like to see us as a community, as a Black community, support that media, support Black media, support positive images in the media, and call out media outlets, you know, that aren't controlled by us, that are funneling, you know, these destructive images of Black males, of Black women onto primetime TV in their films, you know, where they depict Black men like as criminals, as dangerous, as something to be afraid of. And they depict Black women as being angry, as being emotionally unstable and stuff like that. I want us to get to a place where, you know, like that is called out like routinely, and where it isn't, you know, like kind of made to be like how Professor Walkington was saying, like almost like pornography, where it's like it's being sought out by a predominantly white audience. So yeah, I would just like to see images of folks that look like me in media portrayed in a more positive light.
Thank you, everybody. And I want to do a follow-up on something that Javi said that really stuck with me, which is now we have this technology. And you know, it's funny, in a very sad, heartbreaking sort of make you want to break stuff kind of way, that that's the same thing that me and my friend said when they got Rodney King on video getting beat. We said, oh my God, finally they got it on video. Finally they got it on video. Now they can do something, right? And we saw what happened then. The LA uprising happened at the same time, like we're seeing the uprising happen now. And we were saying as young people, young adults, the same thing that I'm hearing you say. And so I'm going to take it back to the power of media, because we're talking about one generation. One generation. And guess what? I didn't know that Emmett Till was a jump off to the civil rights movement when I was your age, right? And so it's interesting how the power of media to make a construction, right, is so powerful on the one hand, and to disappear others on the other, right? A line from one of my favorite movies, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist, right? How is it that we go from generation to generation to generation under the same iron fist of violence, disappearance, decimation of our communities, and yet here, and this, you're not the only one. I've told my, if you all been in my classes before, you've heard this from me. I ask these questions and the questions again and again and again. What happened in LA? Did you all know about Ferguson? This is not the first time we've seen tanks in the streets. This level of military violence against protesters, that was used in people's homes. They took that stuff through garages. And so bringing it back to the pornography and something that you all talked about, these images that get used over and over again. One thing we don't see are images of women getting killed over and over and over again. And I wonder what you all think about the idea that just like Emmett Till was the spark, people could not stomach the idea of this child being beaten in this way. If women and young girls, as they are getting killed, were put into that pornography of pain, would it be enough to turn people's stomachs enough to do something again and spark even further into the next phase out of our communities and into the places like those corporations that have the power to shut these systems down? Can we talk, Martine, you want to get in on this? Dr. Abumaye, who wants to start here?
I can jump on. I think that's a really important question. I'm going to jump on by really referencing, I went to a protest for Black Lives Matter San Diego. It was a moving car protest. And it was mostly organized by Black women. And what I loved about how they organized that protest through City Heights was they didn't just, go reference Black men who were killed by the police. But one of the sites we went to in City Heights, San Diego, was a Black woman who was killed by her husband, right? Her name was Muna, she was a Somali woman. And I think what was important about referencing that as central to Black Lives Matter is to show, right, that it's not just Black men who are being murdered, right, but Black women, and Black women are not just being murdered by the state and police, but also Black men, and that we need to be intersectional with our framework, right? Because, in many ways, Black women are far more likely to experience violence at the hands of Black men, and that our movements need to be intersectional, right? Because if it's not intersectional, then who's going to be free in that movement, right? And if a movement that only centers men, only Black men will become free. And I want to add even further, I think looking at the 13th is also looking at trans Black women as well, right? And the kind of violence that trans women experience in prison is also central to understanding that as well, and why we need to be intersectional. As you know, I want to reference Dr. King, right? If we don't free the most marginalized in our community, then who are we going to free? And Audre Lorde mentions that as well, right? And so central to Black feminist theory. But I do really think that what I'm really excited about this new generation of Black Lives Matter, right? More so than even the civil rights movement, is really the way how grassroots it is, but also how central, right, these intersectional identities are becoming to that movement as well. And I think this documentary, that's one thing I wish you would have touched more on, is looking at these intersections of Blackness, right, and of Black death as well as being important.
I'll jump right in there after you. Oh, I'm sorry, cut you off again. Okay, so back to Dr. Abumaye. Actually, I was working a shift that day, the day that City Heights called it the caravan happened, and I got stuck in it in my Amazon truck. I was driving for Amazon. So like I called the dispatch. I was like, hey, like there's a protest going on. I'm stuck. Like what do I do? They were like, okay, well, you're off. So like long story short, I was supposed to get off like the very next exit. Could have gotten on the highway. I actually stayed like in the caravan from I think like Fairmount, I think is where I hopped onto it, like, and went down like a mile down the road. And that was, to be honest, like one of the most beautiful things I think I've ever been a part of, is seeing that caravan. Because like you were saying, there were so many, you know, Black women leading the charge that day. Black women have historically, you know, led the charge and been on the front lines to fight for the Black community in general. But, you know, seeing that, you know, it almost brought tears to my eyes, you know, like sitting there, you know, watching, you know, look like a sea of cars, like for as far as I could see. And you see Black women with signs, you know, the cars like have the names of Black women, Black men painted onto them. So that was a really, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was a really moving, you know, moment for me as well. And I'm glad to know you were there as well. So, but back to the original question, I do think seeing more exposure of the violence against Black women, because it isn't as exposed as we see, you know, the media and the images of violence against Black men, especially state violence against Black men. I think that could strike, you know, that chord with like some people. But I think most importantly, like it should strike a chord with us, like Black men, seeing Black men, for me, you know, being assaulted, brutalized in media was enough for me. Seeing it happen to Black women, you know what I mean, should enrage us. Like it should be like final straw, you know what I mean? I don't know if that answers your question, but I know, at least from my standpoint, I do think seeing more representation, more awareness of the violence that is happening against Black women, not only state violence, but, you know, we talk about like domestic violence, and thinking about the community I grew up in South Florida. One thing I look back on and think about is also, you know, community violence against Black women, you know, maybe not physical violence, but, you know, emotional violence against Black men. I think about Black women, sorry. I think about how Black women, you know, were treated in my neighborhood, you know, growing up in the hood and stuff. You know, names they were called, ways they were just, you know, like kind of made to feel as though like they couldn't, you know, love themselves. Making them feel as if the Black men in that community didn't love them. And looking back, I just think about, you know, how a lot of those women that I grew up with must have felt back then, to, you know, feel as though the folks in their community who are supposed to have them, you know, to the fullest, are shaming them a lot of times for like their sexuality, shaming them for things as silly as not, you know, being able to afford to have a certain type of clothing and stuff like that. I think, like Dr. Abumaye was saying, there needs to be a real movement, a real push among Black men to, you know, like you see on the signs, like protect Black women, protect Black trans women as well. And, you know, I think we'll really start to, you know, take that step forward as a community in attaining our freedom, fighting for our freedom.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in really quick, Mr. Garrett, before you go, because I love this topic and because it's so important, but it's the long history of violence against Black women. Everything from when slavery, one-drop rules, and it gave slave owners permission to rape in order to create more capital, more people, more slaves to produce more labor, all the way up to the era of the welfare queen. And so we saw the brutalization of just the thought of the Black woman, and then, you know, ongoing to rape and murder, and it continues. And it seems like a nonstop cycle. And we demonize the Black men, but there's the women who are often, you know, the ones who hold it down, because mass incarceration affects both men and women. But as Black men go to prison, women are the household strong front. You know what I mean? They're the ones taking care of babies. They're the ones taking care of the house, sending money to folks, working hard. And then often we just forget about the brutalization historically up to current day, you know? And so I think that it's a constant conversation that we have to continue having in our classrooms, where real organizing and activism happens, to the streets, and we always got to praise them. So I just wanted to throw those little pieces in there. Mr. Garrett.
Yeah, I agree with what you say. I believe that, you know, mass incarceration doesn't only just affect African-American males, but it does affect African-American women too. But what's worse is that when people view mass incarceration, oftentimes they just neglect the African-American women's struggle. And that can be very damaging, because if you don't incorporate them into the struggle, then there won't be a change. And yeah, I think that if you bring up the African American struggle, you have to also look at the different intersectional groups that affect it differently.
Thank you, thank you. Related to that question, switching a bit to the discussion of prison reform, right? That we're talking about, or, you know, abolition, which way we want to go, right? Just do away with it completely. Whichever way you want to talk about it, much of the work that's been focused in the past couple decades around prison reform specifically, to end mass incarceration, tends to focus more on low-level, drug-related, nonviolent crimes. And yet we know that a lot of Black women, Indigenous women, trans women, and other folk are in jails, not prisons, for violent crimes, right? You have violent communities, you have violence happening in communities. You have people brutalizing each other. You have women who often go to jail for defending themselves against the type of violence that Martine was just speaking about. And yet these types of crimes, I'm not sure if they're the inappropriate victim type of thing or whatever, but we have I think the Prison Policy Institute, I looked today, said that it is almost a third of the Black and Indigenous women that are in our prison industrial complex are actually in jail for violent crimes. So what can we do within our communities, and what can we do for consciousness raising that includes those people who are in jail for doing some stuff to some people, or whatever the crime may be that isn't a low level or drug related crime? What about the folk who are also separated from their communities for different types of crimes, right? That constitutes a big chunk of those parents missing from those homes. So how can we include those folk in these efforts as well?
So I can jump in this one. And I think the biggest thing, especially speaking about, you know, the community, I come from the Black community. One thing I think that could change that is just, you know, emotional intelligence, and also addressing the topic of mental health and being able to outspoken about one's own mental health, one's struggles, not bottling things up. Because I know in my household growing up, that wasn't something, you know, my mother always tried to, you know, create an atmosphere where, you know, we could come out and be outspoken and stuff like that. But my father definitely wasn't the type of person, you know, like, don't talk about your feelings with me. Like, go to your mom, like, if you want to talk about, like, how you feel and stuff like that. Like, I got bills to pay. Like, I can't afford to have feelings. So, you know, you got to kind of operate this way if you want to survive. That's kind of, like, you know, in a gist, what we're taught. And I think what begins to happen is as you grow, you have, you know, things just piling on top of one another. Stress, being impoverished, you know, in itself. Different things you've got going on in your community, being over-policed, being surveilled. You know, I think in a lot of people, you develop really a real anger that that kind of just bruise over time. And also you develop habits that, you know, you see the generation before you, like passing down to you. Like, I know one thing for me is, you know, it's common in the hood, and it was in my household too, where, you know, like, you know, if someone messes with you at school or something like that, in elementary school or middle school, you come home like tears in your eyes. And, you know, like for me, I use my dad as an example. Dad sees you, he's like, well, what did you do? I was like, oh, I like told a teacher or something like that. And he was like, well, like, don't come home tomorrow unless like you fight that boy. You know what I'm saying? So you kind of learn that, okay, the way I solve my problems is proving, you know, that I'm dangerous. You know, you have a saying even in communities, in a lot of, you know, impoverished communities, you know, that have like prominent gang culture, you know, there's a saying, stay dangerous. And it comes from, you know, like that way of thinking. It's like, you know, like emotional intelligence to the side, talking about my feelings, talking about the fact that, you know, like something like I really got stuff going on that like I need to talk about. It's like, no, like I'm not going to resolve my conflicts. I'm not going to address, you know, things that are going on within me. My reaction is to lash out. My reaction is to show, you know, like, hey, I'm not to be messed with. I'm not the one. That's another sin. And, you know, that's how you deal with it. And I know for me, that's how I came up. That's how, you know, a lot of the people that grew up with me, you know, came up is, you know, violence was seen as, you know, a usable option to resolve conflict, or to at least, you know, deal with conflict, you know, immediately. So I think that's a place to start. I don't think that solves, you know, the problem, because you do have folks like, I apologize if I you know, mispronounce her first name, but Centoya Brown, I believe is her name. You do have instances where Black women and Black folk in general are jailed, are, you know, cycled through the prison system for violent crimes, but really, you know, for defending themselves, for, you know, trying to leave a situation where they were being harmed, where, you know, they feel as though their life is threatened. I think also, you know, if I can be, you know, kind of raw, that's something that happened in my household as well. You know, police getting called to the house, you know, police talking to my mom when she was trying to defend herself from my pops. You know what I mean? And, you know, I'm sitting there thinking like, well, why's my mom in handcuffs? You know what I mean? And I think that's something we got to address as well, is, you know, the way instances of domestic violence or just violence in, you know, intimate relationships in general are like handled by law enforcement. Because to be honest, you know, there's probably a lot of women, you know, sitting in jail right now for no other reason than, you know, this is the day they stood up for themselves. This is the day, you know, they were like, all right, like I had enough. Like I need to defend myself. I need to do something to get out of this situation right now. And, you know, we're sitting behind bars for it right now.
The statistics bear that out, Javier. You're absolutely right. There are a large number of women who are sitting in jails and prisons for doing exactly that, that being the last time. That was it, right? Yeah. And since we're on this topic, when women do get sent to jail or prison for aggressing upon their abusers, they tend to get sentenced exorbitantly longer than men get sentenced for doing the same thing to women. Anybody else want to speak on how we can get more support for the end of mass incarceration to be inclusive of those folks like Javier was talking about, who are defending themselves and imprisoned for what was considered violence, just for defending themselves? Or does it need to be framed that way in order to get people to jump on? What do we need to do to be more inclusive of folk?
I'd like to jump on that. I think it's a really important question. Looking at that, right, as well, like thinking about, you know, the ways in which, you know, Black women and women are incarcerated in many ways. And I think, right, you know, you can't really tackle that question, right, without really tackling, you know, patriarchy, right, and the ways in which women are devalued. But I think that reform is not the solution, to how to free these women of color, right? And I think in many ways, why are women incarcerated for defending themselves against their abusers, right, is because we live in an entire criminal justice system that believes the only way to deal with a particular act of violence or wrongdoing is with punishment, right? And I think that what I love about this documentary is that it shows that the prison industrial complex and the prison system came about as a result of slavery. That's why it's called the 13th, right? Slavery was never abolished. And that the prison system is an extension of slavery, right? We are still, Black people, Black women are still enslaved. And this is what it means when you put people inside of cages. And I think for us that the solution for those women is that we need to abolish prisons. We need to abolish jails as a way to punish people, right? And I think an alternative, right, is looking at sort of community healing projects, transformative, restorative justice, right? That is not a system based on punishing people and putting people in cages, right? But healing the community and healing the victim and the perpetrator of the violence, right? And I think in so many ways, we can't imagine a system outside of the system we have today, where America, America has, 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the prison population, right? And I think that with this Black Lives Matter movement, it's showing and is making more possible, right, is that you're seeing campaigns to defund the police, that we have to really, that prison abolition and jail and police abolition can no longer be marginal ways of looking at social justice and reform, that they have to be seen as legitimate ways, right? Because what I always try to teach my students is prisons didn't always used to exist. Prisons are relatively recent historic ways of punishing people, right? And that since we had a world before prisons, before putting people in cages, we can imagine a world without prisons, without jails, right? And that I always tell my students, right, people say the same thing about slavery. People are like, let's not abolish slavery. Let's just make the conditions in the plantation better for slaves, right? And they would say, well, not all slave masters are bad. Some treat their slaves good. It's the same way that people look at not all jails are bad, not all police officers are bad. It's not about being a good person within the system. It's about acknowledging a prison system, a policing system, like this documentary shows, that is built off of white supremacy, that is built to maintain institutional racism, that is built off of incarcerating and destroying Black bodies and Black people. And if you work in that system and happen to be a good person, you're contributing to it, right? It's about abolishing that entire system itself. And I think prison abolition, as Dr. Angela Davis says, it needs to become a reality, right? And people say, what do we do outside of prisons? What do we do people who commit crimes? And it's like, people are already articulating alternative ways. If y'all are interested in that, there's a really group of radical queer Black women in New York called Safe Outside the System Collective. And they have a 20-point platform for what to do when someone commits a crime in the community, how to deal with it. And they have individuals in the community whose roles are to tackle with that, to heal the community, right? And I think that is really the only way that we can really help these women, is to really tackle these systems and really imagine, right? Just like we need to imagine a world without prisons, we need to imagine a world without patriarchy, right? Because what's happening to these women cannot be taken outside of the context of patriarchy. It's not just a jail issue, a prison issue. It's an issue of how patriarchy functions in this country. And as Dr. Walkington has pointed out, right, like patriarchy was central to how slavery functioned, right, to how Black women's bodies were treated, right, to the maintain, right, to how white supremacy is also maintained, can be understood outside of patriarchy as well. And I think, that is the only solution for these women to actually have freedom and for us to really be free in this world, is we need to take abolition not as an extremist standpoint, but as a possibility. And right, I was looking at the Minnesota, city council defunding the police, or trying to imagine abolishing the police, right?
I agree with what you two said. I believe that the policing system and jails do not really fix the problem of crime. But even more to that, I think that we also need to change how crime is, or how crime is perceived with African Americans. So as Javier mentioned earlier, some African Americans or some people of color can go to school and they're taught that they're supposed to be violent. They go home, they're taught to be violent. But even more than that, they listen to music. They listen to rap music, and I'm taking this from Professor Abumaye's class. They listen to rap music, and it glorifies crime. It glorifies stealing, murder. We need to really change how crime is perceived, and we need to change the criminal justice system.
If I may jump in really quick with two things. One, I'm all about prison abolition within my movement, Project Rebound and beyond, right? And but looking at reform, actually, Angela Davis in this film says, historically, when one looks at the efforts to create reforms, they inevitably lead to more repression, right? And so we think that we really, I mean, to move forward, to really truly abolish the system, you have to really tear it down in order to recreate it in as a just and fair system that works for all, right? And we're never gonna get there with just continually reforming. Reforming is not gonna work, and this is what I fear right now. We're moving and seeing these defunding of police or refunding certain areas. I mean, do we need more police? No. Do we need more militarized police? Absolutely not. Do we need well-trained officers? That's just reform. We need to really tear down the system in order to create it fair and just for everybody, right? More officers, and I don't even want to say more officers because I don't truly believe that more officers is the solution at all. I think that communities can, in a sense, with restorative justice practices, with trauma and justice informed care, with organic community spaces to create healing. Like, there's so many other things that communities can do that will abolish the system completely, right? I think that if we go back to tribal days, I mean, tribal days, and look at communities, they really did care for themselves. You know, good eating and farming practices, everything from you know, women led the family units and they controlled what was going on. I mean, this is such a powerful movement that we just lost due to patriarchy, white supremacy, and beyond that. There's so many other things, just toxic masculinity in itself, the inception of gangs and protection within the community that turn violent against each other. The system wins when we go up against each other, and it's working perfectly fine for them, right? I do have one comment from one of our participants, and this is going to spark a little conversation, maybe even a question, but Kareem says, it's easy to see how people can say they would never plead guilty to something that they did not do until they actually are fighting for their life, like Khalif Browder. Unless you have actually been in that position, you have to choose between saying you did something you didn't do and losing your freedom. And we see that a lot with women, just admitting to things that they shouldn't even be admitting to and doing long sentences for them, right? Goes on to say, it's hard to understand for most people. That was from Kareem, one of our participants.
Can I jump on that? I think that's a really excellent comment. And I think what I like about this documentary and this panel and the 13th is you can't understand the criminal justice system without understanding Blackness, Black studies, and Black history. And I think anybody who wants to understand our system needs to understand Black studies. And I say that because as Black people, we are guilty from the moment we exit the womb, regardless of whether or not we committed a crime. And I think the reason I say that is we need to understand the concept of the criminalization of race, that Black people we live in a system where Black people are inherently criminalized, even if you did nothing, right? And so often we're focused on this idea of looking at the politics of criminalization or what's called the racialization of crime, right? Like drug dealers are Black, but we need to look at the criminalization of race and a system in which Black people, right, are inherently seen as criminal and as dangerous, right? And this didn't begin last year, right? From the 1800s, 1700s, academics were saying, there was actually an article in 1905 that said that integration was bad because the more education Black people get, the more criminal they will be. This was by a sociologist with a PhD, and he published this article, right? And it was used to fight against and support segregation, right? And how are the ways in which not just the media, academics, Black people every day are criminalized for doing simple things: breathing, walking, sleeping, right? Talking, right? In so many ways. And all of us have these stories. And I think that unless we tackle the ways in which Black people are criminalized, right, we can't end this system, right? And I think that's with what happened with, Khalif, right, was that regardless of what he did or who he was or how he spoke, he was already seen as guilty in the eyes of the police. He was already seen as guilty in the eyes of his classmates, or his teachers, right? His people who see him on the street, right? People who clutch their bags when they see Black folks, right? And I think this is why there's so much anger with the protesters, because almost every Black person can tell you a story in which someone saw them as dangerous and as criminal, right? Regardless of what you wear. You can wear a suit, they'll still see you as a criminal, right? And I think acknowledging and challenging that is really important for us to imagine an alternative world, right? To imagine and challenge, right? And this is why, again, right, we need to tackle the broader systems that make this possible. And this is white supremacy, right? And the flip side of the criminalization of race and Blackness is whiteness is seen as inherently legal and uncriminal, right? So in the middle of the Black Lives Matter movement, there was a beautiful hashtag that was called criming while white, which is white people committing crimes and not seen as criminal or as dangerous and getting away with it, right? As being, right, so on and so forth, as not. And so I think understanding how race and power functions is really important for us to really tackle that question, right? And I think I always tell my students when I teach my classes, I get racially profiled all the time, right? And I'm a college professor, right? And people inherently see me as dangerous, right? People inherently see me as threatening because people see Black people as criminal and as threatening, right? And unless we tackle that issue, right, we'll never get to the heart of the problem.
You know, I'm gonna jump next on that. I read this quote from from this book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and say that that when white people go to trial, they have to explain why they're not guilty. But when Black people go to trial, they have to explain why they are innocent. And I think that is, and that's true. It's not. It doesn't only happen when we're on trial, but just when we're living our life, when we're walking down the street. And I personally have examples when I felt that I would be perceived as violent, or I would be perceived as less than, even though I know who I am and I know that that I'm not. But it really is just, it feels like society really pushing down on you, you know? And I think that we really have to change that by peacefully protesting, showing that we're more than just statistics, more than just we're more than what the media says we are, you know.
Yeah, so I'll jump in after that. And I think a good point that you, Michael, as well as Dr. Abumaye brought up is the fact that for Black folk in the United States, due process isn't really a thing. Like, instead of it being innocent until proven guilty, we have to kind of fight to show that, you know, we're not guilty. We kind of have to prove our innocence. And when I think back, I just think about, you know, the fact that it doesn't even come only from, you know, police officers who hyper surveil communities, who like literally just roll around sometimes, like even out here in my hometown and out here where I live in Southeast San Diego, like officers like will just be fishing for things, you know, instead of it being like, oh, I'm here to, you know, protect the community. Police officers have never, you know, they weren't created to protect communities. They're created to suppress the people. But you know, instead of, you know, their intention being, okay, like I'm gonna, you know, try to keep this community safe. You know, if you know, something happens where, you know, we need to, you know, deal with an issue, like we'll do that. Instead of it being that, it's more like, I'm gonna find something. It's only a matter of time. So let me go look. Let me go in this area where, you know, I know it's kind of, you know, like a hot spot, and stuff like that. So just growing up, like I observed, you know, that as well. I'm sure, like, you know, all of us have. And it doesn't even just come from officers, you know, like I've experienced it with teachers. I've experienced it even with community members who, you know, see you already as someone being guilty, uh, for whatever reason. I remember, just as an example, in 7th grade, I had a teacher ask if I was from a gang. I had a teacher ask if I was, you know, gang involved. I had another assistant principal in middle school, same middle school, R.J. Murray Middle School, it's off the chain. I had an assistant principal, you know, ask me if I had ever been incarcerated before. I was 12 years old. She asked if I'd ever been incarcerated before, because of you know, my friend group in school pulled me aside to ask me whether or not I'd been incarcerated before. And just looking back, you know, you see how, you know, it starts early, starts almost immediately, for us, the criminalization of our skin. And going back to, you know, Black folks growing up with a sense of like self-love, self-worth, definitely has an impact on that as well. Because I know with me, you know, long before, you know, my first arrest as a juvenile, like I would already see myself as like, you know, like someone will like, well, dang, like maybe, you know, maybe I am, you know, I guess like what they say I am. You know what I mean? You start to question yourself. You start to, you know, question what you know about yourself when the world is constantly throwing that at you, when the world is constantly criminalizing your skin. And what's sad is I think for a lot of young Black folk, you don't even realize that it's happening to you. For a lot of young Black folk, and especially for myself, it was just kind of like a fact of life. Like, oh, like, you know, this is what it is. Like, this is how people act. This is how police act. You know what I mean? You know, they can stop you, frisk you, not give you their name, stuff like that. And I think that just goes back to, you know, being another reason, going back to the Khalif Browder case. I think it's just a perfect example of why we cannot have reform. Because even with, you know, the different reforms and stuff like that that we've had, the officers themselves, the system that's creating that, the system that sorry, backtracking, the same people that write these policies, the law enforcement agencies that are supposed to be out there enforcing these policies, that are supposed to follow a certain set of rules, a certain set of instructions, are supposed to abide by these laws, aren't even playing, you know, by the rules that they're supposed to play by. So even with reform, you're still gonna have, you know, those officers that are, you know, out, you know, fishing and stuff like that. You're still gonna have those officers. They're gonna stop, you know, that group of Black boys walking home from a pickup basketball game, and, you know, we're gonna question them, grill them. You're still gonna have, I think I saw it a couple of days ago, where, you know, you have officers rolling up on like a group of Black kids, and it is basically holding them at gunpoint, literally holding them at gunpoint and stuff like that, because they're already criminalized. If you have a system that tells you that folks with Black skin are the criminals, that's who you're supposed to go after, you can never really reform a system enough to like cycle that out, to get rid of that, because it's embedded in the system. It was created to criminalize Black bodies. So that's what it will always do as long as that system exists. That's
Thank
the
you.
essence. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you very much. Well said. Martine, I believe we have a comment from one of our attendees. I'm going to try. Floyd Lai, I'm going to try to allow you to talk with my tech savviness. Oh, nope, I can't do it. I don't have the capability. There
I
you
see
go.
Floyd.
Can you hear me?
Floyd. Yeah.
So my question is just, I heard a article or a story on NPR. They interviewed black folks who are in law enforcement with the intent, I think initially, because they had some poor experiences, they wanted to sort of change the system. I was just curious your thoughts about whether that's futile because of some of the things that you've already shared, and or what is the role of folks who are in those positions? What role do they have to play as far as in regard to abolition or reform?
Can I jump in really quickly here and just, to make note that the way that these insidious ideas of, stereotype constructions of criminality from birth work is that they work internally as well, right? And so we need to move beyond the idea that it is necessarily just an us versus them situation, but it is all roads lead to white supremacy, right? And white supremacy is like toxic rain raining down upon all of us, right? A white supremacist capitalist patriarchy is what is the perfect bubbling up for these environments to exist. And so the idea that there are not Black officers engaging in these types of activities is unrealistic, right? It's unrealistic because part of the way that the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy works is to dangle a little carrot and let a few in and say, if you act right, you're going to get the goodies too. Well, we're going to use you as an upright against your community, right? And so I just wanted to remind everyone here that it has not gone unnoticed, nor is it of, I think, myself or many of the people, any of the people here on the panel, the understanding that these types of constructions of criminality do not impact our communities as well. I think Michelle Alexander put it very well when she talked about these zero tolerance policies, and I believe they showcased it in the movie. She absolutely wrote about it in her book, The New Jim Crow, as Michael was speaking earlier, that, part of the way that these things work is to get community members to buy in to these perceptions of criminality, to also push. And there was, I believe, an assembly member or a congressman who was also guilty of doing the very same thing for those zero tolerance policies and mandatory minimum sentences, right? And so we also need to, hold ourselves if we're going to go back into our own communities and say, listen, we need to have these conversations, as one of our, pre-submitted questions alluded to. We need to have these conversations with the people around us. It's not just them who thinks these things about us. Some of us think these things about each other too. And Javier was speaking about this as well. We need to have those conversations. Not that it's our fault, not that we're stupid for thinking it. That's the way the system set it up. That's the way that it works, right? So I just want to make sure that I put that little bit in there before we move on. And I'm sorry, Floyd, could you restate your question? I jumped all over it. Not and forgot.
No, I think you touched on it. Thank you. I was just curious. I mean, I guess not coming from the community, what is that role for them? With regard, and I agree with you that I think sometimes it's a way to pit communities against one another. But I was just curious about folks that are in those roles. Do they have a role to play? Is it futile? Do they just need to kind of reassess and maybe come to their own sort of consciousness of what that looks like? It's complex, and so I was just hoping maybe you could speak to some of that.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that question. I'll preface this by saying I think that it's not just Black police officers, but also white police officers really need to be engaging in anti-racism work, right? And I think, in terms of working within the system, police officers, Black police officers, to make the system and policing less racist and more equitable, I mean, one thing that can be done is education, political education. And I'll say SDSU, not that long ago, made Black Studies course a requirement for all criminology students, right? And I say we could do that on our campus, right? And in our department, I mean, a lot of police officers, they do go to college, right? Take a criminology or criminal justice course and being educated in this politically, right? And getting, right? And not just learning how the criminal justice system works, but learning how white supremacy, race, Black history, anti-blackness functions is one way in which, you know, Black police officers and white police officers even more so, right, who have the power can work not just as allies, but, you know, as co-liberators. And I think that is something that really needs to happen and can really be instituted on our campus, right, is to have Black studies as a graduation requirement for all criminology and justice studies students, right, and people who, right, and our goal, at least for our department, is if students go into law enforcement, that they go in there with the intent, right, of having a radical consciousness, of being aware of that, you know, police officers enforce the law. If the laws are inherently racist, there's really very little police officers can do, right? If you got to kick a mother and her children out of their house because the landlord is creating an eviction notice, and you know this is inherently racist, sexist, and problematic, you have to enforce that policy, right? And again, so many problematic things in our history, from slavery to Jim Crow, have been legal. To this day, we have laws on our book that are inherently racist, that inherently work against folks of color. And I think that just having, right, enough Black police officers, you could have the entire police force be Black police officers and still have incidents of racial profiling, racism, right, so on and so forth, right? I mean, that's why I think for people it's really important to look at least for my studies, I look at policing not just in America, but also all over the world, right? I study the Kenyan Police Department, and in Kenya, the police are all Black. And they still reinforce white supremacist notions. They still inherently protect the rich at the expense of the poor. They still maintain domination over the people because the laws that are written in that system are inherently unequal and unfair, right? And again, there can be oftentimes, and even what happened with what was it, the Ferguson Police Department, but also looking at the Baltimore, right? The Baltimore City Council at that time was primarily Black, right? But again, the police officers in Baltimore were mostly ticketing in Black neighborhoods and not white neighborhoods, even though the power structure in Baltimore was still predominantly Black, right? So just having Black people in there is not enough, right? And I think the political education and consciousness raising is essential. And as Dr. Walkington said, right, if these Black folks believe in white supremacy, and not white people aren't the only people that can be invested in white supremacy, Black people can be invested in it too. And we have Black people invested in white supremacy who then have power. That's when you really see how inequality and injustice can be maintained. So Black studies is one answer.
Yeah,
That's right.
I'm glad you brought up the point of you know, education, especially Black studies, because I do think that Black studies is ultra important when it comes to understanding why policing in itself, you know, is as you said, inherently racist. And I also like that you touched on, you know, the idea that it doesn't really matter who's wearing the uniform. It's the duty that you have to, you know, fulfill, like while you're in that uniform. That is the reason why, you know, policing altogether needs to just go. Because, I mean, you could have that knowledge of, you know, systemic racism in America. Like you can know the history and the struggle of Black folks here in America. But the moment you put on that uniform, your job is to enforce the law. And if the laws are inherently racist, like you not enforcing those laws means you're not doing your job. You don't do your job, you get fired, you're not a police officer no more. So that's one thing, especially even in my family, with my little, not whole family, but just one of my little brothers. Like I had this talk with him because he was saying like, you know, like I do believe like there's good cops. I was like, no, there's good people maybe who are cops. There's good people who are officers. But while that person is in uniform, their job is basically to be complicit in the oppressing of Black folk. You cannot have, you know, a good cop just like you cannot have a good slave master. You cannot have a good overseer. You know what I mean? It's your job. You know what I mean? So I'm really glad you brought that point up, because I feel like I've been having a lot of discussions like those lately, with Black folk, white folk alike. And going back to the education thing again, I just want to share that yesterday I was reading about Assembly Bill 1460. It actually passed the Senate floor yesterday, which, you know, if all goes well, that would make ethnic studies a graduation requirement across the CSU system. And I do think that would be, you know, a big win for us all together, because I think that could get, you know, those Black studies courses, you know, to people, to students who really need that knowledge. And also, I'm a fan of it because I don't know how it's going to play out, you know, I hope that would lead to the hiring of more Black professors across CSU campuses as well, because, you know, we should have Black folks teaching those Black studies, you know, courses and stuff like that. So I hope it leads to, you know, more knowledge, more awareness out there. And I also hope it leads to more opportunities for Black folks looking, you know, to educate, stuff like that.
Thank you, Javier. That is a really good place for me to segue into what needs to be the last question after what has been a very fruitful discussion, because we're running out of time. So I'm going to combine a couple of the questions that came in from people before we started. And so what we're talking about in education, we had two folks that asked about what students can do to challenge microaggressions in school, and also how they can be an ally for the Black community. So can we combine those two and say, how can you be an ally to the Black community on our campus? Give some suggestion for folks. Want to go ahead, Michael?
Yeah, I can go first. The best way to be an ally is to just start off by eliminating the microaggressions that you see in your life and in the life around, in the life of people that are around you, and just to speak up. So if you hear someone making a racist joke or even a sexist joke, like anything, if you speak up and you tell them, oh, that's not cool, like maybe don't say that, it without trying to embarrass them, it would ultimately decrease the microaggressions that would happen in our world or in our nation, and it would change. And I think it would change the mindset of how people view African Americans or people of color.
Thank you, Javier.
Yeah, so for me, would just be to show up. You know what I mean? When Black students do things like hold an event, when they're raising awareness about something, show up. Take the time out to, you know, like support the Black students that are there on campus that are trying to tell you this is what's going on in our community. Like, believe them. Like, actually believe them. And then after that, you know, stand in solidarity with your Black students. So when you see incidents happen on these campuses where, you know, Black students are either assaulted, discriminated against because of the color of their skin, stand in solidarity with those students. Don't let Black issues amongst Black students on those campuses have to be basically don't leave Black students hanging, like on campus. Yeah, so show up. And also, one thing Martine brings up a lot is the difference between being an ally and standing in solidarity with a person, or standing in solidarity with a people. So that's another thing as well. I know I said it already, but just stand in solidarity with those Black students, support those Black students. When we're out there trying to raise money and stuff like that, to open up opportunities for ourselves, to put on events, so that we can share our experiences and just share ourselves with whatever school we're at, you know, support that and be there.
Show up. I like it. Show up in solidarity. Thank you, Javier. Dr. Abumaye.
I mean, mine's going to sound a little bit left of field and slightly radical, but you can pay Black people, send money to Black people. I mean, that is one, right? Venmo, got a Venmo account if you want to send me money. But I mean, I think I say that because really. But you know, I mean, we live in a system of the afterlife of slavery, right? I mean, everybody who's not black benefits from anti-blackness materially in terms of the positions it gets you, the jobs it gets you, right? The discrimination that black people experience. So, you know, transfer some of that money is one way, right? To help and fund, to be more, you know, serious about this, but, you know, fund black organizations, right? Spend your money on black political organizations, black businesses, black people, nonprofits, right? Black community spaces, invest in blackness. And I think even more so, I'm really impressed by my students, both Michael and Javier. I mean, y'all, I love how y'all holding it down, but really become politically active, organize, right? And one way you can organize if you really want to be an ally for black folks is organize on our campus. We can organize to disarm campus police, right? That's something that every student, no matter who you are, you can join these organizations, you can become politically active, and you can join, you know, these organizations, and you don't have to be in the leadership, but you can support black students who are at the forefront of the leadership for these movements, right? And dedicate your time, effort, and energy, and this is something we can do. And I'm going to echo Dr. Udbi Ali, who would have been here and hold her down. She's always saying, in Toronto and in Canada, campus police are not armed. We don't have to live this way, right? And again, we can really make it possible to disarm campus police, right? Especially when we know how disastrous campus police are in terms of their engagement with black students. So these are some of the suggestions that I'd like to give, not just allies, but co-conspirators for black folks.
Yeah, if I can just jump in there really quick, because I just have one definition for y'all. When you stand in solidarity with somebody, with a group of people, true definition is, you know, holding them up, giving them honor, respect, protecting the dignity, especially when that person and that group of people are not present, that you're always standing in solidarity with them, even if they're not in the room with you, right? And so that to me is what we teach in solidarity, is that you're gonna defend me, especially when I'm not around, right? You're gonna defend the dignity and respect and honor and love that you have. So true allyship, true solidarity is always being there for them, even when they're not there. You know, speaking up for them, making sure we protect our people. You know, so I just wanted to throw out, you know, that definition. Dr. Walkington.
Well said, well said. I think that we are at the end of the time that we have here. So in the last 7 minutes that we have, I'm going to ask, is it 2, 4, 6? I don't do math really well. I'm going to ask if everybody gives a 2-minute closing thoughts, if you all would like to sum up anything that you wanted to make sure that you said related to 13th, structural and institutional oppressions against particularly black folk. But also I want to remind you all, and this is going to be the thing that I leave you with before I close out, our oppressions are connected, right? It will swing back. If it ain't on you now, it will come back round your way. So we cannot lax. If you are not black and you don't have black folks in your life that you love, and you didn't see yourself reflected in this documentary, give it 3 seconds. They're gonna come for you. Look at those deportation facilities that we already had. Michelle told you back in 2010 when she wrote that book, they were building it then to fill it with y'all. Who's the next group that they're gonna put in if we don't put an end to all of this? So I'm gonna ask if Michael—
Got chills, shit. I just got, seriously, I got chills on that one. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask if anybody else has any closing thoughts, or to give your closing thoughts, and we've got 2 minutes apiece. Michael, if you please start us off.
Okay, yeah. So first of all, I want to thank you all for joining. Thank you for coming to this event. I'd like to thank the panelists and the hosts for hosting and for being a part of this. Yeah, I think that being an ally is what we really need, and we also need people to be in the solidarity with us. As Martin Luther King said, injustice somewhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and now more than ever, that's really what we should be focusing on. The Black struggle isn't only something that the Black community should fight for, just as and also the Black women's struggle isn't something that only Black women should fight for. It's something that we should all stand together, and we should all and we should all face the higher ups and to demand justice and equality.
Thank you. Thank you. Javier.
Yeah, so with me, I just hope we all keep this going. I hope we all continue to share space, continue to call for the abolition of the American penal system. And I also, you know, hope that we continue to celebrate one another, especially Black folks who are on campus, Black staff, faculty, students alike. I think it's important for us all to share space. I think it's important for, you know, us to sit and have discussions with folks like Dr. Walkington, Dr. Abumaye, because you are, you know, living, breathing representation. And, you know, I think it's necessary for us to see that, because before coming to Cal State, I had never seen, you know, a Black professor before, let alone like have the opportunity to sit down and talk with, you know, two Black educators. So I know we have the Black Mixer on campus. I don't know if that's once a year, once a semester, but things like that, I think we should just continue to, you know, keep having. I think we should continue to use Juneteenth, you know, as a way to celebrate ourselves, and also to, you know, educate and tell people like, hey, this is our history. Understand that, you know, Juneteenth was Juneteenth, but we still aren't free. Let me tell you why. Or better yet, like, here's like the proof, like, please, like, you know, educate yourself on it, and then build some understanding on why, you know, Juneteenth was, you know, the day slavery was abolished in the United States, but really wasn't abolished. It just transformed itself and, you know, continues to transform itself. And just a really, really strong takeaway that I took from 13 was actually something my brother kind of brought to light, is the connections you see today versus during times of slavery, with how the system is not only protected by itself, but in a way also protected by, you know, white America altogether. So when I was watching the 13th, you saw how like folks would say like, hey, like, there's, you know, some good slave owners. Oh, those boys that were lynched, like, those were criminals. Like, they did this or this, you know, to like a white woman, or they stole this, or they didn't pay this debt, or he was misbehaving, whoop-de-whoop. And you see it today too, when you see, you know, the lynching of Black folks by, you know, police officers. You see, well, hey, like 50 billion years ago, you know, he was arrested for stealing a candy bar out of the store. Like, you know, he wasn't exactly, you know, a law-abiding citizen, stuff like that. You basically hear, you know, people siding with the system when that system takes the life of a Black body. And I think that was almost like, you know, in eerie comparison for me, because I was like, wow, that was the first time I really, like, you know, was able to draw that line, like, wow, like slavery, you know, really didn't, and it just transformed itself. Everything else is still there. The name is just different. The way it functions is still the same. The divide, you know, between, you know, American society when it comes to folks who, you know, are for abolition, and then like you kind of have like a sector of folks who are for reform, and then you have folks that are all for the system, love it because it isn't really affecting them, and if it is, they just haven't, you know, woken up yet and realized like, hey, this is affecting me.
Gotta
so,
come
yeah.
to consciousness. Gotta come to consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just crazy that, you know, really the only difference is, you know, for the folks in my bloodline who were born into slavery, you know, like their worst nightmare was, you know, like white man on horseback, you know, patrolling the plantation. And for us, you know, coming up as Black youth or just as Black folk in general, it's white man, you know, riding in a police interceptor, you know, circling around like our block, circling our neighborhoods. Outcome is still the same. You know what I mean? We're meant to be controlled and meant to be criminalized, and ultimately we're just seen as, you know, like a dollar sign. Because when we do go to these correctional facilities, you know, we're funneled into, you know, like penal farms and stuff like that that are going
Yeah.
on where we're growing and producing crops. I think in the 13th they said like they make like some device for military aircrafts or something like that.
Oh, they
But
make
yeah,
all
it's
kinds of stuff.
crazy.
Coffee makers. The prison industries is a big, big money maker, and the capitalist, again, the capitalist patriarchy, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, is the perpetuator and the maintainer of those systems and the benefit of those systems. Thank you, Javier. I appreciate what you said about the coming to consciousness and needing to know. We're all learning. This is not the first time that I've seen this film, and I learn something new every time that I watch it. Dr. Abumaye, would you like to close us out with a final thought for the evening, please?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Walkington. Really, and I wanted, you know, briefly address Javier's comment. I don't think any Black student should go through their entire educational career without ever seeing a Black professor. And I think one thing we can do from this documentary is to understand the problem, understand mass incarceration, anti-Blackness. And right, it's not just that Black lives matter, but Black professors, Black ideas, Black art, right? Black music, Black women matter. And I think one way we can do that is we can hire more Black professors, and SDSU just passed a Senate resolution that they are guaranteeing a cluster hire of 5 tenure track Black professors by next year. We can do that on our campus. We can demand a cluster hire for Black professors who specialize in Black studies and looking at these issues. And that's something we can take away from this moment and an action item. And students can also make that possible by demanding that the Black student population that the Black professors reflect the Black student population. So I want to finish off with that.
Thank you. Thank
Beautiful.
you. Martine.
Yes, yes, yes. So thank you all very much, Ashley and Ashley Fennell, Damon, Michael, for putting this on. Javier, good to see you. Thank you for your words. I love you. Dr. Abumaye, to Dr. Ali, who unfortunately couldn't be with us, but thank you so much for your words. And thank you, Dr. Walkington. I know we got asked to do this last minute, and you know, that energy you got, we killed it. We're good. We're good. So I guess we're closing. Dr. Walkington, you got the last word.
I appreciate y'all for putting this on. I appreciate the thought-provoking conversation. I appreciate the energy and the love in the space, and especially the men in the room who can say that they love each other. Y'all give me hope for mankind, okay? I really do appreciate it. And please do take up Dr. Abumaye's call out to get involved and Javier's call out to show up, right? We're going to be back on campus. And in the meantime, things are still going on. Activities are still being had. So if you want to get involved, you can reach out to anybody who you see on this screen, and we will connect you to people who will get you involved in whichever way your particular talents can be utilized to the movement. So thank you all for showing up and taking the time, and have a good evening. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all. Love you too, by the way, Martine.